Hi. My name is James Kenley. I serve as the Executive Director of the Vail Symposium, and on behalf of our Board of Directors, welcome. The Vail Symposium has been offering affordable, diverse, and thought-provoking programming to the Vail community and now beyond since 1971. Tonight, we have our first ever, to my knowledge, hybrid program. So we have a beautiful audience here in the Vail Valley, and we have what I think is a beautiful audience online tonight as well. We know that many folks in our community haven't come back yet for the summer, and we've heard the feedback that we want virtual programs at the beginning and the end of our seasons. So tonight, we had the good fortune of Dr. Ward being in the state, so we thought we would convene locally and have a global audience online as well. We are a nonprofit organization, and tickets account for about 10% of our operating revenue. Donors at every level make it possible for us to continue to evolve how we do what we do. I'd like to thank a few organizations and individuals right now. Our presenting sponsors are discovervail.com, that's the town of Vail, and the Frechette Family Foundation. Our event sponsors are Vail Daily, the Vail Resorts Epic Promise, and the Antlers at Vail. The summer season is generously underwritten by Cindy Engels, and our virtual programs are sponsored by Alpine Bank. Tonight's program was developed in partnership with World Denver, and I'd also like to thank Lori Prentice and Rob Schilling for showing our guests a warm welcome to our community. Would you please give everyone a round of applause? For our regulars, I'm also excited to introduce you to the newest member of our team, Megan McGee-Bonta. To my right, your left. She's our new program manager. This is her first program of this season. She'll help us with questions from the virtual audience here in a little bit. Tonight, we discuss a topic that appears in headlines ranging from nuclear proliferation to balloons, the source of the pandemic to the web's hottest social media platform. And just today I saw they are the diggers of the world's deepest borehole into the Earth's crust. Of course, you're here online. I'm talking about China. To be our lens into a rich and complex subject is a seasoned journalist and a friend of the Vail Symposium, Greg Dobbs. Greg is the winner of 3 Emmy Awards and has covered conflict and culture around the world and here at home, including meaningful time in China, Russia, and throughout Europe. Our subject matter expert this evening studied the Russian and Chinese languages at Columbia University and earned his PhD in China-India relations at the University of Oxford. In addition to rigorous academic pursuits, he has extensive and fascinating experience on the ground in China, and I hope he'll have an opportunity to share some of those stories with us tonight. Dr. Jonathan Ward. He is the author of 2 books that anyone interested in China should have on the shelf. First came China's Vision of Victory, a handbook to the global strategy of the Chinese Communist Party. That's China from the Chinese perspective. And then just this spring, you do us all the favor of holding it up, The Decisive Decade. This articulates the path for the US and our allies to maintain control in this consequential power struggle. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Jonathan Ward to the Vail Symposium for the first time, and I hope not the last, and to invite Greg Dobbs to get our conversation started. Greg?
Thank you, James. And I will tell you, I think it will not be his last because this is his first time in Vail and he loved his first day.
Yes, it was great. We've had a wonderful time here. It's been a true highlight of the book tour.
And I have to tell you, this morning we had a nice 20 or 25-minute conversation on the phone. The phone, by the way, is that thing you use for taking pictures and getting email. And after we talked about tonight's program, we talked a little about Colorado and specifically Vail, and I said, by the way, it's a very outdoorsy, friendly, casual place. And by the way, I said to you, You do not tonight, he comes from the DC Beltway, you do not have to wear a suit and tie. And then I hung up and I thought, what if he takes me literally and shows up in shorts and flip-flops? But you did it just right.
Well, thank you.
In his introduction, James gave the name of the book, The Decisive Decade, and the subtitle, American Grand Strategy for Triumph over China. But I think, Jonathan, for those of us in the room, for many more watching the live stream, it's hard to understand how to deal with China until we understand a little better what we're dealing with. So can you, in the broadest brushstrokes possible, without getting into specifics yet,
Sure.
answer that question? What are we dealing with?
Absolutely. So what we're dealing with at this point is probably the most consequential geostrategic competition we've had since the early Cold War. And I mean when things were hard, when we didn't know what to do, when we were at the very beginning, and I'm a Cold War historian of modern Asia, all of that, and having reference to those sort of early years in the 50s and 60s, when we were just getting a sense of what was at stake and how to deal with it together. I think we're back to something like that today, where the People's Republic of China is a nation state, ruled by the Chinese Communist Party, essentially an authoritarian dictatorship that is, we're sitting here 2 days after the anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacres. I mean, there are a lot of things we're going to talk about this evening, but a very dangerous state that takes America as its primary adversary and has been working on an overall strategy since the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949 to ultimately rise as the dominant superpower and to what they call return China's position of power in the world. And this, in a way, has nothing to do with America. It's their own design. But we stand in the way of that. They've always seen it that way. And now we're going to have to deal with the consequences, because what we did for 30 or 40 years, let's say, we can go back to Kissinger's opening to China with Nixon in the early 70s, but then really when we started to get our businesses involved and build supply chains there and bring capital into China and open our markets to them, I mean, we basically, through economic engagement, converted an authoritarian state into an economic, technological, and ultimately military major power and superpower. So what we hoped in American strategic thinking, and this is obviously not my generation, but prior generations like Kissinger and afterwards, was that China would become what people called a responsible stakeholder, that we would create global stability by having robust ties with them, sort of build the world together. Many, many American officials at the highest levels have expressed that verbatim, even if people are, to some extent, rewriting the record today, now that we're seeing some of the dangerous consequences. But the point is, we did not get what we expected, and it's probably one of the biggest and most consequential strategic errors in our foreign relations history. I think that will probably be what it looks like in the long run, because now we're going to deal with what it's like to have China as an economic and technological superpower, as an adversary, working on a strategy to surpass us, to displace us, to overpower us in the Pacific and beyond. And those are just some of the elements that we can get into this evening, but at this point are very easily demonstrable, in fact, beyond the news cycle, and very well, I think, understood by many people. So what do we do about it? And that's why I wrote the new book, in addition to my first one, just what exactly should the United States do to prevent ourselves from losing that contest in the long run.
So when you talk about China's global ambition to be a dominant superpower, in the old days, in the first Cold War, because this might be another one, in the first Cold War, the definition of superpower was nuclear. In fact, those words went hand in hand. You were a nuclear superpower. But you're talking about the whole spectrum of military and nuclear power and economic power and technological power and diplomatic power in a contest for alliances and even political ideological power.
Absolutely. And so the new book goes across what the United States needs to do in the four major arenas of classical Western grand strategy. So economics, diplomacy, military, and then finally the arena of ideas. I mean, how do we compete successfully in the major arenas of power? And in this case, I mean, I think the most fundamental and important difference between where we're headed now and, let's say, the first Cold War is a lot of this is going to turn on our ability to maintain our position as the world's leading economy. I mean, that's really where the biggest piece of the contest goes. I mean, it's, I think, one that has a very high chance of military conflict. I mean, Xi Jinping tells us on a regular basis that he's preparing to fight and win wars. He talks about fighting the bloody battles of our era. I mean, all of this. I mean, it's a country that has territorial claims all around Asia. They're working closely with Russia as a military partner. I mean, it's absolutely a military power with military ambitions that's changed the balance in the Pacific in ways that are incredibly dangerous to us. But the only reason we're talking about any of this is because they became an economic superpower. Even in the 2010s, they surpassed us in terms of total goods trade. I mean, now China has more, is the #1 trading partner of many more nations than the US. They rival us in a variety of different key technologies and strategic industries. When we think about what we were before the Second World War, we were 3 times the combined industrial output of Germany and Japan together. Today, China is double our industrial output. So we gave that away through the economic engagement era. And they've converted that into military power. And we're going to need to do what we can, as I see it, to ensure that we win the economic competition, that we do not cede that position to them. And that's something that America's never had to do. Our history over the last 100 years and more as a strategic actor, as a superpower, even just as a great power that was rising, had everything to do with the fact that we became the world's largest economy at the turn of the sort of 1800s to 1900s. And we're about to see that in real jeopardy. So we have to start there, and that's a lot of what this is about.
So you talked about them doubling our industrial output, if I understood correctly.
Right.
Are there other areas in that wide spectrum of interests and competition where, I mean, they are building, we are, if we can, rebuilding. So are there other areas where we just don't have a chance to catch up?
No, I think
or to maintain our dominance.
I think we're going to be, if we focus, if we're serious about this, if we understand the nature of the contest and how to deal with it, I think we can absolutely win across the board in many of the most important categories. But a lot of that is going to have to do with U.S. reindustrialization. I think we're seeing this, for example, with the Ukraine war. I mean, everyone has probably heard about the challenges we're going through in the defense industrial base, the ability to continue to supply munitions, whether it's Stingers or Javelins or what have you. How are we going to continue to do that? So, for instance, the Pentagon understands that we have a defense industrial base problem, but we have a much broader industrial base problem as well, and we're going to have to rebuild that. That's going to help. We're going to have to win in the key technologies and industries, and I've laid them all out here. I mean, there's, we can, hear about the AI competition or quantum or, space. I mean, a variety of different things. But the bottom line is we're going to have to, I think, win a contest for overall GDP, for overall national wealth. I mean, all of that is what creates power in the long run. And they are a true contender to that at this point. I remember when I was writing my first book, I had to continuously, as the drafts went forward and it came back from my editor and that kind of thing, revise upwards. China's 60% of the US economy. Okay, now it's 65, now it's 70. I think by the time the book was published, it had gone from 60 to just 10% right there. And most major investment banks now continue to project Chinese growth at 4 to 5% for the rest of this decade. So there is the potential for them to not necessarily surpass us, but close the gap significantly from where we stand. And they have an absolutely global strategy, investment in all regions of the world. We've all heard about the Belt and Road Initiative. We can talk about all that, but they are playing games and learning how to master certain elements of power that we just don't even recognize anymore. But we can do this if we get a grip on what's going on.
Are the Chinese, with a population north of 1.4 billion people, which is roughly 4 times the size of the American population, are they in any way impeded by what I have read as roughly a quarter of their population, particularly in the far western and northern regions of the country, who still live in utter poverty? I mean, roughly as many people as inhabit the entire United States of America still living in utter poverty. Does that impede them? From a political and social point of view, do the Chinese have to see to those people's lives before they can continue on this great run they've been on?
Well, I think, when we look at drivers of Chinese growth, not just today, but in, future projections, I mean, part of this is urbanization, part of it is the potential as a consumer economy, just getting to more consumer, let's say, percentage of GDP as opposed to exports and government investment. So they still have potentially a ways to go in that. That's what a lot of businesses believe. And then, there's the fact that they're not necessarily going to deal with those sorts of needs first. I mean, they're building a blue water navy at this point. The Pentagon has told us very clearly that China is the world's largest navy. They expect to have nearly 500 ships by the end of 2030, whereas we're struggling to keep 300 going. And the largest missile forces, largest air force in the Indo-Pacific, largest army. So they're not shy about investing, very heavily into military power, despite all of these issues. And at the same time, there's still growth potential in the country, and that's what we're seeing as well. So this is not yet a stagnant power. It's still a rising power, even if it's rising more slowly. But it's rising from a far more significant. At this point, it's about a 18, 19, 20 trillion dollar GDP. We're about 25, so we still have this lead, but it's a much smaller lead. I mean, 20 years ago, they were a fraction of our size.
For clarity, although she probably will not be president, she probably will not be president in 20 years' time when they reach that point. Nevertheless, did I understand correctly that you believe he would not hesitate if he saw it in China's interest to go to war?
Well, look, I mean, he talks very clearly, and I think it's very clearly, the Communist Party is preparing China for military conflict. I mean, that's just a matter of record.
They're building machinery like there's no tomorrow.
Right. I mean, one of the statistics I have in the book is that in about a 3 or 4 year period, they pumped out the equivalent of the entire British or Japanese Navy in terms of total tonnage. That's in 4 years. They're the ones with the shipyards. We don't have shipyards. That's an alarm bell that our naval strategists have been sounding now for years. So, it's the place that has an industrial base in a way that we once had. And I think that's one of the key concerns here. You look at traditional American strategic power, and you're talking about the sleeping giant and the industrial giant, and we've basically given so much of that away over the past 30 years of globalization, which, to some extent was just about creating this dependent relationship with China that is, I think, we're going to see is very much to our disadvantage. And the intentions of the party are pretty explicit. So yes, I mean, they are telling us that they're preparing for conflict, whether that's Taiwan, whether we've already seen violence on the Himalayan borders with India. There's a lot of what people call gray zone or hybrid warfare type violence in the East and South China Seas, where you'll see Chinese, coast guards harassing fishing vessels from Southeast Asian nations. Or did I just get cut off here? I think my mic is gone. So in any case, okay, we're back. But yes, I mean, the military side of this is very important. And for me, as someone who's in a sense a historian of, both Chinese diplomatic history, but also Chinese modern military history. I mean, they were not shy about fighting wars in the 20th century. I think they've allowed us to help, to perpetuate this myth of China as a peaceful nation. The peaceful rise of China was the real marketing slogan of the 2000s and all of that. And many Americans would, I think, have sort of parroted that. But in the Mao years, I mean, they fought the United States in the Korean Peninsula. They fought the entire United Nations, on behalf of, communism at that point. I mean, Stalin and Mao and the Kim dynasty in Korea. Then there were multiple Taiwan Straits crises. They recycled Korean War veterans into Vietnam. They planned Dien Bien Phu with the Vietnamese, so they helped the Vietnamese throw the French out. Then, of course, they were helping the Vietnamese during the Vietnam War with us. They fought India in 1962. They fought the USSR in 1969, and then later on Vietnam. So a lot of military power. And this was when they had, what Mao used to call the People's Army. This was not a modern military. So today they have a modern military, and the rhetoric is not abated. So I think we're dealing with something far more dangerous than most Americans understand.
I think that the headline stories that all of us read or see on television have to do with, particularly in the last couple of weeks, conflicts between American aircraft and Chinese aircraft, conflicts between American ships and Chinese ships in the South China Sea. Tom Friedman, the distinguished international columnist for the New York Times, he wrote about a month ago, he said, the smallest misstep by either side could ignite a US-China war that would make Ukraine look like a neighborhood dust-up. Now, I covered arms control talks between the Soviet Union and the United States in both Geneva and Vienna, and I liked Vienna better. And everybody, including the Russians, whose ideological lens was so different than ours, understood one thing, known as MAD. That's the acronym for Mutual Assured Destruction. And in case you don't know what that means, it means, you could take us out, but if you do, we'll take you out as well. Did the Chinese get that?
Well, look, I think we're in the early stages of understanding how nuclear dynamics work in this. I mean, I've presented at U.S. Strategic Command on the role of nuclear weapons in Chinese grand strategy and have some, exposure to those problem sets. But we know that they're going to expand their missile force by 3 to 4 times by the end of this decade. So they're building, they're going to go through a nuclear buildup right now that I think we're all aware of. But I think we're dealing with something very different because for the USSR, I mean, we Cuban Missile Crisis notwithstanding, and we had this shared concept of what deterrence looked like, and we managed to have a Cold War as opposed to a hot conflict. And I think now there are many commentators and columnists and such that sort of ascribe equal responsibility to the stability of the U.S.-China relationship, and they're not accounting for the fact that on the other side of this, in Beijing, you have a regime that is, not only carrying out a genocide and going through what H.R. McMaster called the largest peacetime military buildup in 20th century history, or in the last 100 years, I think is what McMaster said. I mean, that's all. That's not that's not something that we did. But they have all of these territorial disputes that they believe they are ultimately going to resolve in their favor. And, so I think it's very different in this case. It's not the same as the USSR. I mean, I think it's a place that is studying very closely how to win a conventional war regardless of nuclear conditions. They have a doctrine that I talked about in the first book in China's Vision of Victory called war control, which has been studied by U.S. defense analysts, I think, slightly understudied, but still known to people. And it's this idea that war can be controlled, like an engineer would run a machine, and that if you could actually fight a conventional war despite, the nuclear situation. So we're dealing with some very dangerous concepts. I think in a way that may be reminiscent of Soviet communism. We're dealing with a teleology of history, meaning an endpoint in history. I mean, the Soviets believed that they would win and capitalism would lose. China's Communist Party believes that China will win, and that's just the destiny of history, is that they will ultimately prevail. And of course, Mao, and this is debated by historians, but Mao scared the Soviets away. I mean, they canceled the nuclear program with the Chinese in the late 50s and early 60s because Khrushchev thought Mao was insane when it came to nuclear weapons. I mean, Mao used to tell him and other heads of state that we could absorb, hundreds of millions of casualties and communism would still prevail. So, that's debated as to whether that was a tactic or a true belief. But I think we are dealing with a state that has a history of violence, that is unafraid of that, and that has incorporated it so dramatically into their official rhetoric that you used to have to read Chinese to see that, but today it's much more explicit, even in English language.
Before we leave the military piece of that big spectrum behind, a question about Taiwan, because everybody, if they're aware of anything in the conflict between the two nations, it is, the three nations, including Taiwan, it is that particular thing. And I know that this is well below the level of analysis that somebody like you applies to the relationship, but what do you think are the odds, in a very general way, that China, either in the near future or maybe the long-term future, will in fact attack and try to incorporate Taiwan, which of course is an important Western ally, and which of course, or most likely anyway, would bring Western powers, including us, into the conflict?
Sure. So the way that I would look at Taiwan, and I think the way to think about it is, this has to do with deterrence. I mean, if we're able, not just the US, but as an alliance system, able to affect deterrence, meaning that China's leaders would never see themselves as having a decisive advantage or even a clear opportunity to succeed, let's say, at an invasion of Taiwan. I mean, we have a vote in this, not only as the United States, but as an alliance system. I included a passage from a Chinese Air Force manual in my first book, where they talk about, if once we have seized Taiwan, we will be able to create famine in the Japanese islands, through blockades. So it doesn't just impact us. I mean, this would impact the entire region. It would impact Japan. It would impact our allies, our entire structure. So, I think we're going to be coming together more and more to have a shared sort of concept of how to do Pacific security and also deterrence over this. So as long as we're able to utilize the windows that are open to us to supply the right kind of military equipment, to get the allies engaged, to get political focus on this problem set, to get our militaries focused on it, which is already happening, I think, in a very serious way, we get a vote. I mean, what you don't want is for the other side to, as I said, roll the iron dice. I mean, Putin obviously did that in Ukraine, but that has not happened in Taiwan. So as much as the Communist Party wants to do it, as much as they're even foregrounding that now, I mean, they're talking about it in their rhetoric, reunification is what they call it, with Taiwan can be achieved and will be achieved, says Xi Jinping at a commemoration speech just a few years ago, for example. I mean, that kind of rhetoric is getting more and more serious. So I think the intent is there, the force structure is there. They'd like to do it, but it can still be prevented. So in that sense, it's something where if we do the work of preventing it, we can prevent it. If we don't do that work, that's a very different thing.
I'd like to circle back to help us understand China a little better to the first question I asked you. What are we dealing with? If I were sitting in Beijing right now interviewing your counterpart, a Chinese expert analyst of the United States, and said, what are you dealing with in your relationship with the US? What would the answer likely be?
That's a great question. Well, they do have, their chief ideologist, this man Wang Huning, who in some ways is the most interesting member of the Politburo. He spent 6 months basically backpacking around the United States, which I think is a little ironic. I mean, I spent 2 years.
Well, that's what you did in China?
Right, absolutely. More time than he did. But he wrote this very interesting book, which I think very few people have read, called America versus America. And it's about American contradictions sort of being, basically the things we've achieved, but then the weaknesses we have. And he did this, study, which I think is inaccurate in a lot of ways, but also insightful and interesting. But he's basically the important ideological and strategic mind at the highest level of the Communist Party. So, I think what they believe is that we're in decline, that we are, divided enough that can be exploited. That's the Russian belief, even more so. The Russians, as we've seen, have done whatever they can to exploit our divisions. I think the Chinese are starting to see that too. But they believe that they can beat us, that we're capable, but also in decline, and that China's in the ascendancy. And I think the war risk side of this is very significant. At what point do they believe that they can take us on? Because this contest isn't just about the next 2 or 3 years, it's about the next 20 or 30 potentially. So the idea that there could be a US-China conflict, not only in the near term, but over time, which is why this might be a very long competition, is something that they're clearly thinking about. And they've told us, I think in official writings, China's rise is, even if I had a quote in the first book where they say, look, even if our rise must be, even if it comes at the cost of war, it will be worth it. And it's stuff that is really unfortunate to read, but I used to have to read all that stuff. So I think they believe that they can win. They have an idea of what victory looks like. And at this point, the main concern would be whether or not the US wakes up. That's what I would guess. But I think they study what they call contradictions, and they study our relative power and comprehensive national power is what they call it. And they believe that they are in a good spot and in an ascendant position in most counts.
So raise your microphone just half an inch, please, okay? What are the risks for the United States if we step up our competitive campaign against China?
Sure. So the risks for us, one, I think that to me, the domain that we have to be most focused on is the economic domain. And that's what the decisive decade is about. Principally, it's a US grand strategy. It goes across the whole power spectrum. What do you need to win a comprehensive contest, with a superpower, a global superpower contest? But to me, we need to get our economic strategy together. We don't have one. And that's what we badly need. So I think that's where I would, take the most risk if I were, let's say running this picture of, American strategists, I think need to take the most risk. We're going to need to get our private sector involved. You can't win a global contest without your business leaders, your finance leaders, all of that. And that's not traditionally how we've behaved unless it's in a wartime. In the Cold War, we didn't have these issues. It was a separate world economy. We weren't really trading with the USSR. Today, our companies are deeply embedded in it. So those kinds of risks, I think, will manifest. Stuff we have to do, I think to get our supply chains secure, to get our strategic industries in great shape, to get our key technologies in great shape, to get our companies on our side, and not just us, but the alliance system. I mean, NATO alone is half of world GDP, and that's just a very significant economic force that China will never surpass. So turning our economic capability into strategic capability and having a clear idea of how that works over the decades in this contest. But that will lead to business risks that we're already seeing. I think there are many companies that are in a lot of trouble because of the decisions they're making in the China market. It will lead to higher costs in certain regards until we learn how to manage costs, but we're going to have to do that. I mean, there are many ways to make things around the world, not just in China. And then on the military side, the traditional American approach to military power is about deterrence. It's about peace through strength. And I think if we're able to win the economic game, if we're able to design a very clear and effective economic strategy, we can convert those gains into military power, rebuild deterrence, and get back to what has been called for many times in history, peace through strength. And Churchill called it preponderance, and Paul Nietzsche, who was one of the Cold War strategists, also talked about preponderance, where if you can get to a much, much greater military capability than the other side, that doesn't increase the chance of war. It means that they will not do it. So that's what we have to do. The danger is when you start to lose that advantage, and then the risks become ones that they might take.
Would you say amongst people who do what you do for a living, which is to watch China, understand China, analyze China, look to the future, amongst all of you, is there consensus about this? Or if some disagree, what would they say?
Well, I think at this point there is a much broader consensus on China's strategy, on its intent. I mean, at this point, those conclusions I think have been made. It's still debated a little bit, but I think it's largely been, people are getting the idea that we're in a strategic competition. I mean, there is a bit of a, as in any era, I mean, people that are sort of apologists or accommodationists is what they call them now. But I don't think that's really in the, that's sort of old stuff now. But, I've, in a sense, moved on from being purely a China analyst and even a global China analyst, because my, work was in basically China's foreign relations, China's global strategy. And to me, this is now about the United States. It's what are we going to do? How are we going to handle this? And that's something where I would say not only is there not a consensus yet, but very few have attempted to show us, what to do. And certainly no one who's studied the China issue, or let's say Chinese grand strategy, there hasn't been. So that's sort of a unique thing at this point. So I think that in that sense, it's new ground. I mean, we have not yet arrived at a genuine American grand strategy for this situation. And we haven't really had an American grand strategy since the early Cold War. And we were able to sort of figure that out in the beginning. It was called containment and allowed us to, ultimately prevail in a 50-year, peaceful between the superpowers, global contest. So we're in new territory, I'd say. And so,
but if we have a grand strategy, so do they.
Well, they do, and that's why we need one. So we're responding to theirs. And in my personal work, China's vision of victory was my attempt to show their strategy in their own words, with their own documents, with everything I'd had access to. And then the new one is, well, what do you do about that? And in the now 4 years since the first book came out, but 3 years in talking about it in media and speaking and everything, I've had a lot of time to, how would the U.S. respond? I mean, how can we actually, succeed and prevail against a strategy of theirs that's very clear?
Russia.
Yeah.
It was just, I think, a little more than a year ago that the Olympics opened in Beijing, and everybody probably remembers that President Xi and President Putin declared their friendship with, quote, no limits. Now, obviously, every friendship has its limits, particularly when it's a marriage of convenience like that one. But that said, what are the limits, in your opinion? You're also a Russia scholar. And how does that play into this bigger picture of the relationship between the U.S. and China?
Right. So I think at this point we really have a Russia-China axis. I mean, they have come together. It's a pretty deep relationship. The document, or the moment that you're talking about in the Beijing Olympics last February, which was sort of a 1930s almost moment. I mean, you have the world's two dictators getting together at a boycotted Olympics in the midst of a genocide, and later that month is the invasion of another nation in Europe. I mean, it was very much out of an old, different world. But that document, the no limits was the quote, but it was like about a 20-page document that explained their friendship and their relationship. And they call it the Comprehensive Partnership of Strategic Coordination for a New Era. And it's pretty deep, I think, philosophically. I mean, the whole goal, as I see it, is they're going to work together to take on the United States, both in Europe and in Asia. And that takes us back to the first Cold War, to the 1950s, where Joseph Stalin, before the Korean War, said to his counterparts in China, I'm going to focus on Europe, and you're going to focus on Asia. Any questions? And the next thing we got was the Korean War. So we're in a similar moment, I think. And their military partnership has been deepening. That's not a recent thing. I mean, that goes back, at this point, 10 or 15 years. I mean, I remember I was living in China in 2014 when Putin annexed Crimea. And I used to watch this on Chinese language television, where they would repeat talking points from the Kremlin, talk about how there were, basically snipers in downtown Kiev from NATO and stuff. I mean, just stuff that's just Kremlin lies that they would share. And then they went and built the islands in the South China Sea. So they've been coordinated for a long time now. Their intelligence official meetings, their defense minister meetings, I mean, their bilateral state-to-state head of state meetings have all been quite frequent over the past 10 years. And even during the invasion of Ukraine, which of course is still going on as we speak. I mean, China's been Russia's major supporter in terms of ideology. I mean, if one looks at all the propaganda from the Chinese side, it's pretty astonishing to behold. In terms of economics, I mean, imports from Russia into China have doubled since 2020. And even militarily, I mean, there was the report earlier this year about assault rifles and body armors coming from one of China's major state-owned defense enterprises going to Russia for their war in Ukraine. But then also, there have been multiple joint bomber exercises. I mean, while Biden was in Tokyo in last year, I think in the summer, Russia and China flew together nuclear-capable bombers through the Sea of Japan, and then they did it again this year. They kept the Vostok exercises, which are land exercises. They've done sea exercises, so they're still exercising as militaries. And the latest quote, of course, was when Xi Jinping, and I'm one of the people that doesn't like to call him President Xi, but rather Chairman of the Communist Party Xi. That's what he really is. It's Zhu Xi, which is chairman. Old Maoist stuff. His trip to Moscow, and then he sent the defense minister a couple of weeks later, and he said, changes are coming that we haven't seen in 100 years, and we're creating these changes together. So this is very old 1930s stuff, I think, and unfortunately, I don't think the US provoked this stuff. I think we did the opposite. Our post-Cold War strategy was to bring everybody into a global trading system, and the greatest beneficiary was China. But what we didn't know, and what I don't think we cared to know, was the nature of the intent of these regimes. So here we are with Putin in Russia, Xi Jinping in China. As a student of the history of China, I mean, Xi Jinping was not surprising to me. He's just carrying on the mission of the party. They call it the mission, the central mission of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And now we're facing both of them, and they're working together in a very, I think, clear way.
Since you make reference to the bad old days, can you see the day in the future when people are freer than they are today in China? It is, not in all ways, but it is a repressive state.
Yes.
People do have economic opportunity that they could not have dreamt of, 30 years ago. But that said, they also cannot openly protest. They cannot, they lack the same freedoms we enjoy. Can you see the day under some future leadership when that will change and those restrictions will at least partially be lifted, or is that system too ingrained?
Well, I think it's certainly possible for China's future, but I think we have bet a whole lot on 40 years worth of total engagement, capital, technology, people-to-people diplomacy, basically threw the whole, crown jewels into the system, and wound up with a country that went from being an agrarian state in the 80s to now being a technological superpower. So I think we've done our part to help transform them economically in ways that were unimaginable in the real sort of communist years. But that is possible. But I think at this point, what matters for the U.S. and our allies is to ensure that whatever the destiny of modern China, it does not, its sort of pathologies do not shape our world or the world, or that we're ultimately able to contain it. Because betting on liberalization at this point, to me, I think would be, we've put quite a few decades into that bet now.
One more question about the relationship between China and the US, and we'll throw Russia in here, because tonight is not the only discussion in the United States about China. In DC tonight at the at Brookings Institution, in connection with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, they're talking about collaboration with a focus on China. They're launching, where is it here? They're launching something. Yes, the program is called Advancing Collaboration in an Era of Strategic Competition. In your opinion, are all sides genuinely interested in any way in collaboration to avoid conflict?
Well, look, I think this is what the Biden administration is trying to do. I mean, they've talked to us about guardrails. I mean, they've made that very clear. I think that's essentially, always wise and reasonable to keep an outstretched hand. I mean, we actually had pretty worthwhile dialogues with the Soviet Union throughout the Cold War, but I think in this case, whatever the intent might be, what we're not seeing is the reciprocation of that from Beijing. I mean, what they're trying to do diplomatically is to have us make concessions in order to have meetings. So we've seen the defense, the US Secretary of Defense Austin was rebuffed by the Chinese defense minister, who has sanctions on him for helping Russia with avoiding sanctions, with Russia. So very good reason to have sanctions on that individual. And we just sent officials to China on the anniversary of Tiananmen Square, which was criticized by all kinds of human rights groups.
Just a few days ago.
Yeah, just 2 days ago. So human rights groups are pretty appalled by that, as they should be. And I think we're trying to sort of do this thing where we're recognizing that it's competition, but what can one save from collaboration? But I think this is more of a conversation we're having with ourselves than a realistic strategic direction. At the end of the day, collaboration was the essence of US strategy for so long that whatever it is that we didn't achieve through all of those years, at this point, if we're simply looking to have open channels, you would think that they would want that too. But instead, if you look at the incidents of just the past 10 days with the Chinese fighter intercept of a U.S. surveillance plane, or the I think one of their ships went in front of one of our destroyers just a few days ago.
And those are no accident.
No, and I think that's what people are starting to pick up on, is that the climate of confrontation with the United States in not only the Communist Party, but also most likely in the Chinese Ministry of Defense and certainly Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is about confronting America. That's the messaging that they're giving from the top. So if we're going to continue to do this thing that H.R. McMaster called it strategic narcissism, where we kind of have a discussion with ourselves instead of our adversaries. And as I used to joke about it, when Americans put ourselves in other people's shoes, we put ourselves in other people. Well, if I were in Beijing and if I were Xi Jinping, I'd do. Well, that doesn't mean anything. And for me personally, as someone who spent most of my 20s learning difficult languages, Russian, Chinese, Syrian, and Egyptian Arabic, all kinds of things, spent all this time all over the world, I think the ability to understand what the counterpart is actually trying to do is pretty important. And I think there are a lot of remnants of US strategy that are basically wishful thinking at this point. And we need to focus on how to win a contest, and at the very least, how to dismantle an adversary's strategy for victory, which they have, and I think which is easily proven at this point.
Quick question, does the incident a few months ago with the Chinese surveillance balloon, weather balloon, surveillance balloon, weather balloon, was that just a short application of the brakes? Does that make any difference in the big picture?
Well, I think it does in a sense, and it's funny because they blamed that on us. They were very angry about us for shooting down their balloon. So if you can imagine that, when this is what we're dealing with. And they didn't want to have new high-level meetings because we shot down their balloon. So I think that brought it to kitchen tables in America in a way that hadn't been done before. And as somebody who's been studying all this since I was in my early 20s, China has rarely been a household news issue. I mean, I've never seen wall-to-wall coverage on every television channel of China. Just, you don't see that, except after the balloon. So in that sense, I think it brought Americans, became a kitchen table issue. So I think that was important. It is not, I would say, the most significant aspect of their espionage, surveillance, all of the above. I mean, there's a lot more going on than that. Intellectual property theft to the tune of $600 billion a year is one significant thing. The kind of espionage they're doing is pretty. It's a pretty breathtaking thing to behold. But I think it helped Americans understand this in a more immediate way. And then, the way that they've used it in diplomacy is I think, a little bit offensive, just to think that we were not within our total rights to knock that thing out of the sky on our own continent.
One last personal question, personal on your part. I read that you've crossed China in truck caravans, and you've gone through the South China Sea and cargo ships and everything in between. What should we know, because of your contacts over the years with everyday Chinese as opposed to Chinese leadership and Chinese analysts and all the rest? What would we want to know about if there is such a thing, the average Chinese citizen that we probably don't?
Sure, and I think you're right to say if there is. I mean, it would be a mistake to try to characterize an entire nation in any way. And what I was able to do was being able to traverse China. I rode a bicycle across southern China when I was 22. I went all over the country and with cargo trucks or cargo ships, trucks, or rather cargo ships, trucks. Sorry, it's been a long week. Cargo ships were in the South China Sea and then across the Indonesian archipelago, but went throughout the whole Xinjiang and Tibetan areas in trucks and did all kinds of things like that, and got to spend a lot of time in rural areas, in areas that, I think when Westerners would go to China and be in an office park or in an embassy even, or, be able to go out to places where, you had to converse in Chinese, you had to immerse in that for months on end and get to know people. I think it was a very different side to things, and not one that we always see. And I think there was some, different views of history. I mean, that's how I got interested in the history of modern China, just being out there and meeting people who'd been in the Long March or were telling me about the Cultural Revolution, or who had views of the United States that I don't think people were hearing in business meetings on the coasts, or who had portraits of Mao Zedong on the wall and were telling me how they admired this. And I mean, that's just not what I think most Americans were dealing with when they were, doing the usual sort of business routes. But I think the bottom line, the biggest question I would always have at this point is, what is the fundamental difference between the party and the people? I mean, how popular is the party now? How popular is it going to be? I mean, can they really bring this country along on what they call the mission of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation? Because I think we're going to find it's a little more popular than we might expect. Your average poll will tell you that many people believe China will be the dominant superpower, those sorts of things, because this has been taught for a very long time. And then there's a patriotic education program that began after Tiananmen Square, where they taught people, mainly of my generation, that China had enemies, and those enemies were the Japanese, the United States, the West, and this was because they didn't want to see a generation rise against the party again. So I used to meet people my age that would tell me how they wanted to go to war with America or India or Japan, and it was very surprising to me, but very much linked to the party's rhetoric and the party's teachings over, at this point, decades. So I think we have a country that we don't fully, we need to understand the nature of the party's sort of engagement with its own people and its efforts to bring its population and the whole country along on this very dangerous mission to confront the United States, to become the dominant power, to do all of these things that, as Xi Jinping is saying now, prepare for the worst ahead. I mean, you can't make up what's being said at the top. And to what extent will they be able to bring normal people along with that? It is a country that, created great tragedies for its own people. I mean, Mao Zedong killed more people than any individual in history. So China knows tragedy. And one thing that I think is important, and I talked about this a little bit in the new book, because I think we need to continue to communicate with the Chinese people, almost the way we did in the Soviet Union with Voice of America. That was, I think, very important to our diplomacy, was to recognize that there was a regime and then there was the possibilities of this place aside from the oppression that was going on. And I think the older generations in China that experienced things like the Cultural Revolution, even the Great Leap Forward, which was a massive famine that killed tens of millions of people. I mean, that was only in the late 50s and early 60s. I mean, there are people that experienced that. We want to be talking to the Chinese people about how dangerous their leaders' objectives can be. But I think the younger generations don't necessarily understand that because of the decades of economic growth.
All that said, then we're going to go to questions from the audience. But the Chinese are nationalists. I mean, nationalism, correct me if you think I'm wrong, nationalism means you have great pride in your nation's history and its achievements and its culture and its power. I mean, President Putin has been pushing that to win support. I saw him do it personally at a rally outside of Moscow years ago. He said, we are a great nation in so many ways. And people do buy into that because it's very true. And the Chinese are the same, and that's something we're up against. We are the same here in the United States, but we're not alone. In the audience, who has a question? And James is going to give you the microphone. And remember, when you speak into the microphone, please hold it as if you're about to shove a hot dog into your mouth. Hold it straight out.
You're stealing my thunder, Mr. Dobbs. Greg Dobbs and Dr. Jonathan Ward. How about that conversation? Fantastic, fellas. So we've got plenty of time here for questions, and I know we have some China experts in the house. And I also, in the spirit of our first ever live stream event, I know we've got some questions from the group on Zoom. Keep sending them in, but in celebration of this first live stream, we're going to start with a question from online. Megan, would you bring that to us?
Absolutely. Given the enormous population disparity and how much they have already done to close the various gaps, is it realistic to imagine that we can stay ahead of them in GDP, never mind regain industrial superiority?
Yes, I think it's not only realistic, it's essential. I mean, this is the nature of the exercise to me. I mean, strategically, the United States has to preserve that gap. And part of the reason I think we can do that is, for one, one aspect of that is that their continuous ascendancy requires engagement with the United States and with the allies. I mean, with the world's, OECD sort of developed nations. I mean, that's where a whole lot of the trade surplus comes from. So, our ability to restrict technology, capital, and market access, I think really it changes the nature of their growth rates. And if we're willing to do that, that changes it on one level. But then the other thing that's very interesting and important is we're about to go through this moment in economic history called the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is sort of starting now, but it's going to take place in the 2020s and 2030s, where a variety of important industries are going to go through digitization and major productivity increases. And if we're able to utilize that moment, do the right sorts of investments in the right industries and technologies, we're going to have this acceleration moment in productivity. And I think we have to make sure, in my opinion, that we don't do that as a co-joined, Elon Musk just called us a co-joined, the US and China are co-joined twins. If we do that as co-joined twins, what we gain, they gain too. And with the larger population and the ability to produce things at scale, American innovation becomes their innovation too. It's being stolen on a very well-documented basis now. But if we do that while separating, we can hit liftoff and I think leave them behind a bit and recreate that gap. Because America, I think, still has enormous economic potential ahead of it that's not entirely about population at all. I mean, that's one of the amazing things about this economy is despite our rather small percentage of global population, we're still the largest economy in the world, and we've been that for well over 100 years. So that's, to me, that's the thing that you don't want to lose. That's what Americans must focus on, in addition to military power, is to ensure that we aren't the set of generations that lets that slip away and basically positions us for the strategic abyss. That's why it's the decisive decade. I mean, that happens now and into the 2030s. So that's the job I think we've got. And then you take that and you can rebuild the military deterrence that we need.
All right, as we come to questions in the room, I'm going to reiterate what Mr. Dobbs reminded us of. Please speak directly into the microphone and not over the top or in a general direction, because because then the recording can't hear you. And limit your context if you can, and find your question, and stand if you're able. And we'll kick it off right over here.
Thank you, Dr. Ward. My question is, I'm curious why you skipped over the demography cliff in China. Many commentators suggest that demography challenge in China will be its Achilles heel as it relates to their inability to produce food and feed their population, and their inability to employ their young people, where we just saw the highest unemployment rate for men under the age of 25, which is a big problem if you're the leader of China.
Sure, so these are some of the significant weaknesses, but I think the demography thing that many people hear about, I mean, I think it's becoming this very convenient alternative narrative that's not really true. And the problem is it's true, it's just true later. So it really takes shape in the 2030s. We start to see real declines in the 2030s and then 2040s, but for the rest of the 2020s, that's just not what's at issue. So you're still going to have growth in that country. I mean, as long as they can resolve some of, let's say, their housing weaknesses, which, I mean, they're probably going to be able to direct their financial system to handle that in certainly the near term. But, the demography that we expect to become such a big factor just doesn't take shape for about 10 more years. So we're still going through this period of neck and neck economic competition. I mean, China's share of global manufacturing increased during the pandemic. I mean, they're still gaining on this, and they added the equivalent of the entire Australian economy every single year for the past 5 years, even as we talk about demographic decline. So, and look at American growth. I mean, this is the issue. So I think we love that idea. We're a little too in love with that idea. It doesn't solve the strategic problem. On the other hand, if we start to do the right forms of economic containment now, it starts to synergize with that later on and really allow us to, sort of rebuild that gap. But we have to win the 2020s to get those benefits later. And as to food and agriculture, I mean, I think that's, you can look at a lot of Chinese strategy as about resource security and energy security and all that. They can't feed or power themselves from inside their country, so hence the Belt and Road and even the trade with America. And to me, those are the stabilizing things you'd want in the relationship. I don't think we need to continue to make them high-tech or highly capitalized, but I think it wouldn't be a bad thing if we're providing food and energy as a form of, let's not go over the military tripwire because you need us for these things. But that doesn't necessarily increase their strategic or military power on the cutting edges. So that's an advantage we might have.
We'll take one more here in the room, then we'll go online, and then we'll come back. All right.
Taiwan. I get the impression that we're committed that if they take Taiwan, we go to war. What are our true obligations under the agreement we have with Taiwan? And what is your opinion about when China will do something and try and take over Taiwan?
Sure. So on one hand, the Taiwan Relations Act, which is very interesting from Congress, after we established diplomatic relations with, the People's Republic of China and exchanged sort of Taipei for Beijing as the official representation of China in the United Nations and all the rest of it, there's a line that people miss, which is that the establishment of diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China is premised on the expectation that any sort of, differences with Taiwan will be resolved peacefully. So in a sense, I used to have the exact quote that I've read a million times before. I didn't bring it with me tonight, but from the Taiwan Relations Act, I mean, the entire basis of our diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China is that they will, handle Taiwan peacefully. And they're the ones that have absolutely thrown that into jeopardy. So there is something larger at stake. And then, of course, the rest of it is that we'll provide the means for defense and, what we now call strategic ambiguity. And I think Dr. Richard Haas was here recently, and he's one of the people that's saying we shouldn't have strategic ambiguity anymore, i.e. we should say what we'll do. I think I keep my my opinions on all that off the record, to be honest. But At the end of the day, that's a decision for the President of the United States, and I think we are starting to see a much deeper appreciation of the meaning of Taiwan, particularly in the U.S. Congress. Pelosi's visit last year, and then McCarthy's visit, or rather meeting with Tsai Ing-wen this year, shows that Congress is starting to put this into the category of values and not just semiconductors or military geography, both of which are extremely hard to understate. So there's a lot at stake with regard to Taiwan and also the entire structure of our alliance system. A lot hinges on it. And the line I used in my new book, because I end with Taiwan and just sort of in the values section as opposed to the military section, which in the first book I talk about it in a more military context. But a friend of mine in a government agency said that Taiwan is the Berlin of the new Cold War. And I thought in a weird way, that's sort of an optimistic statement. I mean, Berlin was the place where very clearly the US-Soviet conflict and contest was most visible. And at the same time, we ultimately avoided war over it. Both sides wanted it, and it did not happen. It did lead to crises, and we've been through Taiwan crises throughout history. But if we're able to prevent war in the Taiwan Straits and allow it to be, essentially not devoured by the People's Republic of China, I mean, that's going to be success in the long run, and we have to strive for that. So I'm still on the side of deterrence and just ensure that there are obvious advantages to the U.S., to the alliance system, to Taiwan itself, so that Beijing does not roll the dice on that. And we still have time to do that. The question is, how serious are we going to be about that?
Does how serious we are translate to how aggressive we are?
Well, I wouldn't call it aggressive. I mean, it's literally in the documents. And by the way, I mean, they've torn up every document that we've ever signed with them. I mean, Hong Kong was not, that alerted the British. I mean, I did my doctorate in the UK, and I used to spend time with the British Ministry of Defense, and China and India China was all very far away from them. But after Hong Kong, in the late 2010s, I mean, I think the British changed their view of China quite a bit. I mean, that was a real treaty that it wouldn't fully be absorbed into the PRC until 2047, and of course they just did away with that. They promised Barack Obama that they wouldn't build islands in the South China Sea or continue with cyber hacking and all of that. And then, the WTO, I mean, if we went through the violations, we'd be here for the rest of the week. So it's just, the documents and the treaties and the stuff, it does not matter to them in a certain sense, because their view of history goes to this main idea called the unequal treaties. That China, in its century of humiliation, signed many unequal treaties when China was not powerful, and therefore they're not valid. So their views of the international system in the Communist Party just mean that, when we're not in power, we'll do this, but when we are in power, we'll revise it. So when we look at what's actually been agreed upon when it comes to Taiwan and the entire basis for the recognition of the People's Republic of China, I mean, we're basically just fulfilling all of that and continuing as normal. In the same way that our ships, sail and our planes fly in international waters, and they always will. So it's China that wants to change all that. So I think U.S. aggression is certainly not what's at issue here. And that's the thing that I think is very important for Americans to understand, because I would struggle in history to find a better example of one nation opening all of its, in a sense, resources to another state, which, nonetheless was planning these sorts of things in the future. I don't know if it's ever been done before. Moving your entire industrial base, or so much of it, to a place that's preparing for war with you. That will go down. That's the kind of thing that, we read through Thucydides today, and it's 2,000 years old. I mean, someone will be reading 1,000 years from now how that happened. How did you send your industrial base to a state that fought wars with you, and that was then later telling you that it was going to fight more wars with you? Why did we do that? I don't know.
Okay, let's go to another question.
Let's go online, Megan.
And remember how to hold that microphone out this way.
All right. I'm going to combine a couple questions on a theme. China and Russia. Is there any indication that China's goal is to conquer Russia now that Russia is weaker financially and militarily? And or, as Russian materials have absorbed more Chinese imports, will that negate any impact of American market withdrawal?
Can you say the second one again?
Yep. So as Russian markets have absorbed more Chinese imports, would that lessen the impact of American market withdrawal from China?
Right. So on the first one, I mean, a little tongue-in-cheek, but I wrote in the new book a lot about the Russia-China relationship because a lot of the sanctions examples matter. I mean, a lot of the geopolitical, pieces of it matter. But Putin basically did what no Russian leader has done in 800 years, which is to allow Russia to become a dependency of another nation. I mean, not since the Mongol yoke, is what they used to call it, went in and conquered Muscovy and all that, in the 1240 or something, has Russia been in this position. I mean, Bonaparte couldn't conquer Moscow, Hitler didn't conquer Moscow, but Putin's given the future to the Chinese. And I think that's a very real issue. I mean, Russia has absolutely destroyed its future geopolitically at this point. And China, I think, recognizes that. I mean, on one hand, the economic relationship is very much in their favor, but it's also, I think, very dangerous for the West because a place that cannot provide its own food and energy now has the world's largest landmass right above it with no other real major relationships to go to. So I think we're going to see the continuous consolidation of the Russia-China relationship. And at the same time, there are plenty of Chinese nationalists that believe that a whole lot of, the unequal treaty period and the century of humiliation also includes pieces of Eastern Russia that were, chopped off of imperial China. So there's that line of thinking that exists. And I think Russia's in a very bad spot here. And the other thing but this is also dangerous for us because if we, the way that they've done this, in addition to the state-to-state relationship, is all of their companies. I mean, even though we've seen hundreds and hundreds of Western companies leave Russia. I mean, the Chinese companies have stayed in, and there's been some really good studies on this. I mean, across the board, you have the Chinese banks, technology companies, infrastructure companies. The Chinese ambassador said right after the invasion of Ukraine, just days after it, I think, we have this big opportunity to step in and stay in. And that's exactly what we've done. So for U.S. Economic strategy, I think it's pretty important, in my view, that we are going after the Chinese companies that are solidifying the Russia-China economic alliance. Because at the end of the day, the more that becomes a block, and it's being built through commerce now, the bigger the geopolitical problem we have in the long run. I think we have to defeat Russia and Ukraine, we have to do deterrence in Taiwan, but we also have to hit the sinews of that relationship through economic power. Russia's not a big enough market to absorb China in any meaningful, I think, commercial way. I mean, the trading relationship is, it's multi-hundred billion now, but it's not, on the scale of the world economy that big. So it's an independent problem, I think, for our companies to leave ultimately, or to reduce or de-risk or any of that. It's just separate. But yeah.
Excuse the digression. Is somebody doing a construction project back there? Are you hearing the banging?
Yeah.
Well, who knows?
I'll go take a look. Questions in the room? Yeah, Phil.
This thing is.
How do you see the relationship between China and North Korea going forward?
China and North Korea? That's a little outside my lane. I guess I'm not really a Korea specialist, but I mean, traditionally, the phrase they used to use was the relationship between China and Korea is closer than lips and teeth, and that goes all the way back to the beginning. So I think that was more true before Kim Jong-un. This is me not as an expert, but just stuff one hears. I mean, they lost some of their influence when he came to power and executed, certain, key figures in that regime that were closer to China and what have you. So it may be that he's more of a wild card now. I mean, I would look at the way that I look at. I mean, you've got a Russia-China axis. You've got other major states or sort of significant states that I think are against us in different parts of the world. But I wouldn't necessarily call North Korea part of that axis. It's more of a joker card. I mean, in an unfortunate way. I don't mean that glibly, but I think they're probably on their own side, but they are providing munitions to Russia. as are other sort of rogue states at this point, in the same way that China's providing financing and trading sort of ballast and what have you. But I think he seems to be more of his own character. But that makes them they're just as dangerous as they've ever been.
But isn't Kim Jong-un dependent on China?
Sure. I mean, economically, yes. Yeah, there is quite a bit of a dependency. And I think back for, I've met U.S. and allied trade North Korea negotiators who just seem to be very unhappy with themselves after all these decades of trying to, wind back their nuclear program, and just, obviously nobody got that done. And leaning on China was always, well, if we could only get the Chinese to, the Chinese weren't going to help us with that. They're very happy to have North Korea as an antagonist in Northeast Asia. It doesn't mean they can control it, and that's very different. So I think that's what we've got, is we've got a state that is definitely not on our side, but a little more of a question mark than Russia and China, let's say. That's much more coordinated, as far as I can tell.
I think your microphone's gone up about an inch.
I don't know what to do with this. This is
okay. Yeah. All right, perfect.
Yeah.
I only try to stage manage everything.
Our next question's here.
Yes, hi, good evening. My question is about, could you help me understand why we do not look more at our own role in setting up Cold Wars and struggles? And I say this because when we ended World War II and we left so much of what we now call, the Eastern European nations under the umbrella of the Russians, were we then unaware of how a communist nation would treat these people? Then whenever we decided that, we will just economically empower China, because if the people get more money, they'll see our own freedoms and want to have those. And we blindly sat back and created a giant. Then we have 100 years of history of communism, of which we barely teach in the US schools. So we allow our young people to not even know the evils that are out there, whether it's in Russia or China. And we have young people who may even want or ask for situations that the Russians back before the Bolshevik Revolution asked for. We have people in this country who don't even know that communism and its history is not being taught in our schools. So we have this whole level of ignorance, of which was fine whenever we were an isolated nation. But right now, I see that the real big part of the problem is we are not allowing ourselves the opportunity to learn about the rest of the world, and we are in situations such as when it comes to communism, most people are not aware that every time we buy a product made in China, we're in some way supporting the Chinese Communist Party, that we are playing a role in this whole situation that we're beginning to call a major problem.
Sure. It's a very interesting statement, because I think, on one hand, I would probably agree that we have not fully explained to ourselves how horrific communism really was. It led to, there's a place in downtown DC called the Victims of Communism Memorial, and it's just, the scale of human rights atrocities. And as a friend of mine once said to me, anti-communism in the early Cold War was actually a human rights cause. And I think somewhere we lost that, maybe in the Cold War itself. But that's how I came to this stuff in a very weird way. I thought I was going to be a humanitarian doctor in India and things like that when I was younger, and I was spending time in Russia and China, and ultimately realized we were going to have these geopolitical issues that were so much, more concerning than what I saw as humanitarian work for whatever comparison, but just realizing how the 20th century was just full of the horrors of these regimes, and that they, tens of millions of people were killed by, these, Russia and China. And we can look at, I think, the situation we're in now. The best argument for a new Cold War, and I don't mean to wage one, but that we're in one, is that it's the same characters. This is Russia and China once again, unreconstructed in a certain way, perhaps transformed, but we are back to dealing with Moscow and Beijing in the same way that we did in the 20th century. And these are the two states which, other than the Axis powers of the 1930s, committed the most horrific atrocities in modern history. So I think that's what we're dealing with. And part of me would say, look, we have a role we did have a role. And I mean, it was the American market was what created the rise of China as an economic power, and ultimately the world markets of post-Cold War, US-led economic globalization. That was, we led that, didn't watch where it was going. So in that sense, we bear responsibility, but I think the US has this, on some level, dangerous belief that we can be this island continent, that we can be this isolated state, and it just doesn't work. I mean, it just does not work. And I think the two world wars proved that, and by the time the Cold War happened, we were already a global power with a global strategy. And the transition from the Second World War to the early Cold War is part of why we could set up foundations to be a global superpower and win a global contest. But I think it's very important that America remains international, and that we have this alliance system that's just the work of generations of effort and blood, sweat, and tears, and all of it, and we can't lose that. And it's important that we remain, in a sense, the cornerstone of world order and the guarantor of the democracies in these contests, and that we get through this one, as best we can. But we're dealing with the same characters, and really the dark side of this stuff. And as someone who learned Russian and Chinese in my late teens and early 20s, and just, on one hand, that was motivated just by curiosity, but then pretty soon I was able to see what was concerning about all that. And part of it was the history, but also that some of that wasn't over. And here we are, we're back to this stuff, and it's going to get handed to this country again, I think, a real challenge, but one that we can hopefully handle, peacefully and using our best attributes, which is that we genuinely are a global superpower. We're not isolationists. That's our temptation. It's not who we are. And two, that we can lead. I mean, the nations of the world, I think, do respond to American leadership when the stakes are high enough, and now the stakes are going to be high. And three, that we have this moment to do this with economic power and not through, a global military confrontation. And I think that window is very small, and that's why I wrote this new book, is just to show us what I think is a chance to use the remaining time to find a strategy for long-term victory and long-term peace.
It's hard to hear you.
I may rephrase, as a parent with younger children, and as someone who came into this academic interest, honestly, as a young person, what might be the most enticing threads that either belong in our school system or that we as parents can be introducing to our children so that they can develop better fluency in that part of the world?
It's a great question. I guess I wouldn't know how to answer that yet. I do think we need to teach the Cold War. I do think we need to teach the Second World War. I do think we need to teach the rise of American power in a way that shows some of its moral victories. And I think that was understood in the past and needs to remain a basis of our understanding of ourselves. And when I wrote The Arena of Ideas, which was the hardest part, because the other ones are all things I've trained on or learned about, or military diplomacy, economics, that's more technical in a sense, but ideas is just, I realized we had this incredibly compelling and powerful history of self-reflection of our leaders, from, Kennedy to Martin Luther King to Lincoln, I mean, all the way back to the founders. I mean, we have this tradition of understanding America's role in the world, the American idea, the American experiment, and I think these things are very powerful, and in a way, they're new in a sense. I mean, it's, my publisher allowed me to include the entire Bill of Rights in the Arena of Ideas, and I was very pleased with that. So, and just remembering that we have this unique, political experiment to be a free democracy that's built on human rights, when, much of the norm of history, and certainly the norm of the challengers we're dealing with today in Moscow and Beijing, is to suppress that and to destroy it. and Beijing has made that very clear, and I've laid out some of their own documents where they talk about ensuring that constitutional democracy and so-called freedom of speech and this and that are defeated in the ideological realm. So understanding what's at stake, I think, does have to do with understanding the uniqueness of the United States, and that's a journey that is in a way new to me as someone who analyzes the strategic side, but certainly something that, I guess our schools will play an important role in that.
Jonathan, call this a wrap-up question because we're down to the last couple of minutes. Is there a reasonable possibility or unreasonable possibility that this whole spectrum of competition between China and the US could end up in a stalemate? They win some, we win some, and we end up with the status quo, some near dust-ups, some tensions, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the relationship is roughly the same.
Well, there are a lot of possible outcomes, and we can think about the Cold War. There were times when it looked like we were losing the Cold War. I think that was probably not true when you have total historical insight and understand what was going on maybe better than we did at the time. The Second World War, Winston Churchill called it a close-run thing. We don't think of it that way today. We think of it as, the sleeping giant awakened and, et cetera. But I think this is going to be hard. This is going to be a very close-run thing. And I don't think its outcome is clear at all at this point. But I think the actions we need to get busy on are partly just about getting into the, responding to the situation we're actually in at this point. So we are going to need a long-term strategy, and we have to lay the foundations now through action. We have to stop it, mostly in DC. People are aware of the problem, but haven't yet laid out a direction, and that's where we need to go. But yeah, there will be times when it does not look good.
I don't want to belittle the more important consequences of the relationship and the possibility of conflict, but as long as we can still get our iPhones made in China, as they are. Dr. Jonathan Ward, The Decisive Decade, the American Grand Strategy for Triumph over China. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for hosting me. It's great to be here.
Dr. Jonathan Ward and Greg Dobbs. Greg, thanks so much for facilitating that conversation tonight.